Hi, COM 151 students. Hope you're doing well today. I'm going to present my PowerPoint on copyright and fair use, which is important to me as a filmmaker. It applies to my work very much so. It applies to any creative work, any research, intellectual property. It applies to all of us as consumers of music and art and other creative works. Yeah, so let's get into it. This is really, to me, fascinating and interesting unit. Very much uh, a part of our culture today. Understanding where the rights are for those that make things, that do things, that create for us, and entertain us, or give us kind of a place to rest or have solace in terms of any kind of media or music. Right? How many times have you listened to a song and it's brought you some peace because it's a song you love? That's kind of a place to start in terms of what copyright and fair use are about. Okay, copyright, fair use, remix, and best practices. Best practices is something you've heard of, maybe you haven't heard of. But if you're working in the healthcare field, let's say, uh, there's a set of agreed upon best practices for safety, best practices for disease prevention and transmission, let's say. And those are written, and all healthcare professionals know them or should know them. And all healthcare professionals will abide by them or should abide by them. You could put the idea of best practices on anything, any sort of group, any sort of business or play that you can think of, like athletics, right? A football team has a set of best practices for how they maintain hygiene with their gear. How often do they clean their pads, their equipment, and so on? How is the field prepared so that no one hopefully sprains their ankle or rips up their knee? You can't have a field with ruts in it. So it's this concept of best practices. And think about anything you think you want to do when you grow up, and you could probably easily find online a website, a consortium, a university, a governing body, like how about the Bar Association for lawyers, for example, that would have a list of best practices. Kind of a cool concept to think about, and I want you to keep that in mind as we kind of move forward. I have a couple of definitions of copyright. I'm going to read them. I know you could read them yourselves, but I'm going to let you hear the sound of my voice. Copyright is a form of protection given to the authors or creators of original works of authorship, including literary, dramatic, musical, artistic, and other intellectual works. Okay, and I'm going to say other intellectual works could be research or science, so it's not necessarily limited to art. Another definition: the exclusive legal right given to an originator or an assignee to print, publish, perform, film, or record literary, artistic, or musical material, and to authorize others to do the same. So that's a very similar definition. Look at that second sentence there, second line, where it says or an assignee. So as a creative, you can assign some authority to your agent or to your publishing company or your publicist or your record label, or your executive producer, or whatever that might be, the publisher if you're writing a book, right? So that the copyright does include that option to kind of assign your right to someone else that's working with you. Fair use in US copyright law, though technically not a law, by the way, it's doctrine built into the US copyright law. The doctrine that brief excerpts of copyright material may, under certain circumstances, be quoted verbatim for purposes such as criticism, news reporting, teaching, and research, without the need for permission or payment to the copyright holder. So think of a spoof video you watch where they're making fun of somebody or some organization. I'm thinking Saturday Night Live making fun of, I don't know, a television show or something. I don't have a good example on the top of my head right now, but that's parody, and that's totally acceptable under fair use. We're going to go well beyond the idea of parody, where you're ripping a lyric from a song or a logo from Amazon or something like that and bringing it into a new video or a new play, or having some fun mocking, let's say, Amazon. Amazon can't sue you for taking their logo or taking a lyric from a song, because you're making a new creative work. You're making a new commentary, parody of Amazon in my little example there. Another definition of fair use. In its most general sense, a fair use is any copying of copyrighted material done for a limited and transformative purpose, such as to comment upon, criticize, or parody a copyrighted work. Such uses can be done without permission from the copyright owner. Okay? And the word in the third line there, transformative purpose, a new creative work, a new thought, a new theme, a new story. So you're taking really without permission a small chunk of something else to put into your work as a new creative work. Okay, so ASCAP and BMI. ASCAP and BMI, you may have heard that before. Here's a video we're going to watch and it'll make plenty of sense. This guy, Larry Lessig, does a really good job of explaining in this video that he did laws that choke creativity.
I want to talk to you a little bit about user-generated content. I'm going to tell you 3 stories on the way to one argument that's going to tell you a little bit about how we open user-generated content up for business. So here's the first story. 1906, this man, John Philip Sousa, traveled to this place, the United States Capitol, to talk about this technology, what he called the, quote, talking machines. Sousa was not a fan of the talking machines. This is what he had to say. These talking machines are going to ruin artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer evenings, you would find young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. Today, you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left, Sousa said. The vocal cords will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape. Now, this is the picture I want you to focus on. This is a picture of culture. We could describe it, using modern computer terminology, as a kind of read-write culture. It's a culture where people participate in the creation and the recreation of their culture. In that sense, it's read-write. Sousa's fear was that we would lose that capacity because of these, quote, infernal machines. They would take it away. And in its place, we'd have the opposite of read-write culture, what we could call read-only culture. Culture where creativity was consumed, but the consumer is not a creator. A culture which is top-down, owned, where the vocal cords of the millions have been lost. Now, as you look back at the 20th century, at least in what we think of as the, quote, developed world, hard not to conclude that Sousa was right. Never before in the history of human culture had it been as professionalized, never before as concentrated, never before has creativity of the millions been as effectively displaced, and displaced because of these, quote, infernal machines. The 20th century was that century where, at least for those places we know best, culture moved from this read-write to read-only existence. So second, land is a kind of property. It's protected by law. As Lord Blackstone described it, land is protected by trespass law. For most of the history of trespass law, by presuming it protects the land all the way down below and to an indefinite extent upwards. Now, that was a pretty good system for most of the history of the regulation of land until this technology came along, and people began to wonder, were these instruments trespassers? as they flew over land without clearing the rights of the farms below as they traveled across the country? Well, in 1945, Supreme Court got a chance to address that question. Two farmers, Thomas Lee and Teenie Cosby, who raised chickens, had a significant complaint because of these technologies. The complaint was that their chickens followed the pattern of the airplanes and flew themselves into the walls of the barn when the airplanes flew over the land. And so they appealed to Lord Blackstone to say these airplanes were trespassing. Since time immemorial, the law had said you can't fly over the land without permission of the landowner, so this flight must stop. Well, the Supreme Court considered this 100 years tradition and said, in an opinion written by Justice Douglas, that the Cosbys must lose. The Supreme Court said, the doctrine protecting land all the ways to the sky has no place in the modern world. Otherwise, every transcontinental flight would subject the operator to countless trespass suits. Common sense, a rare idea in the law, but here it was. Common sense revolts at the idea. Common sense. Finally, before the internet, the last great terror to rain down on the content industry was a terror created by this technology, broadcasting. A new way to spread content, and therefore a new battle over the control of the businesses that would spread content. Now, at that time, the entity, the legal cartel that controlled the performance rights for most of the music that would be broadcast using these technologies was ASCAP. They had an exclusive license on the most popular content, and they exercised it in a way that tried to demonstrate to the broadcasters who really was in charge. So between 1931 and 1939, they raised rates by some 448%. Until the broadcasters finally got together and said, okay, enough of this. And in 1939, a lawyer, Sidney Kay, started something called Broadcast Music Incorporated. You know it as BMI. And BMI was much more democratic in the art that it would include within its repertoire, including African American music for the first time in the repertoire. But most important was that BMI took public domain works and made arrangements of them which they gave away for free to their subscribers. So that in 1940, when ASCAP threatened to double their rates, the majority of broadcasters switched to BMI. Now, ASCAP said they didn't care. The people will revolt, they predicted, because the very best music was no longer available because they had shifted to the second best public domain provided by BMI. Well, they didn't revolt. And in 1941, ASCAP cracked. And the important point to recognize is that even though these broadcasters were broadcasting something you would call second best, that competition was enough to break, at that time, this legal cartel over access to music. Okay, 3 stories. Here's the argument. In my view, the most significant thing to recognize about what this internet is doing is its opportunity to revive the read-write culture that Sousa romanticized. Digital technologies is the opportunity for the revival of these vocal cords that he spoke so passionately to Congress about. User-generated content, spreading in businesses in extraordinarily valuable ways like these, celebrating amateur culture, by which I don't mean amateurish culture. I mean culture where people produce for the love of what they're doing and not for the money. I mean the culture that your kids are producing all the time. For when you think of what Sousa romanticized in the young people together singing the songs of the day of the old songs, you should recognize what your kids are doing right now. Taking the songs of the day and the old songs and remixing them to make them something different. It's how they understand access to this culture. So let's have some very few examples to get a sense of what I'm talking about here. Here's something called anime music videos. First example, taking anime captured from television, re-edited to music tracks.
Mana-mana. Mana-mana. Mana-mana.
This one you should be confident. Jesus survives, don't worry. And this is the best.
My love, there's only you in my life, the only thing that's bright.
My first love, your every breath that I take, your every step I make,
And I want to share all my love with you. No one else will do.
and your eyes,
They tell me how much you care. Oh.
read my lips, take dictation.
So this is Remix, right? And it's important to emphasize that what this is not what we call, quote, piracy. I'm not talking about nor justifying people taking other people's content in wholesale and distributing it without the permission of the copyright owner. I'm talking about people taking and recreating, using other people's content, using digital technologies to say things differently. Now, the importance of this is not the technique that you've seen here. Because, of course, every technique that you've seen here is something that television and film producers have been able to do for the last 50 years. The importance is that that technique has been democratized. It is now anybody with access to a $1,500 computer who can take sounds and images from the culture around us and use it to say things differently. These tools of creativity have become tools of speech. It is a literacy for this generation. This is how our kids speak. It is how our kids think. It is what your kids are as they increasingly understand digital technologies and their relationship to themselves. Now, in response to this new use of culture using digital technologies, the law has not greeted this Sousa revival with very much common sense. Instead, the architecture of copyright law and the architecture of digital technologies as they interact have produced the presumption that these activities are illegal. Because if copyright law at its core regulates something called copies, then in the digital world, the one fact we can't escape is that every single use of culture produces a copy. Every single use, therefore, requires permission. Without permission, you are a trespasser. You're a trespasser with about as much sense as these people were trespassers. Right? Common sense here, though, has not yet revolted in response to this response that the law has offered to these forms of creativity. Instead, what we've seen is something much worse than a revolt. There's a growing extremism that comes from both sides in this debate in response to this conflict between the law and the use of these technologies. One side builds new technologies, such as one recently announced that will enable them to automatically take down from sites like YouTube any content that has any copyrighted content in it, whether or not there's a judgment of fair use that might be applied to the use of that content. And on the other side, among our kids, there's a growing copyright abolitionism, a generation that rejects the very notion of what copyright is supposed to do, rejects copyright and believes that the law is nothing more than an ass to be ignored and to be fought at every opportunity possible. The extremism on one side begets extremism on the other, a fact we should have learned many, many times over. And both extremes in this debate are just wrong. Now, the balance that I try to fight for, I, as any good liberal, tried to fight for first by looking to the government. Total mistake, right? Looked first to the courts and the legislatures to try to get them to do something to make the system make more sense. It failed, partly because the courts are too passive, partly because the legislatures are corrupted, by which I don't mean that there's bribery operating to stop real change, but more the economy of influence that governs how Congress functions means that policymakers here will not understand this until it's too late to fix it. So we need something different. We need a different kind of solution. And the solution here, in my view, is a private solution. A solution that looks to legalize what it is to be young again and to realize the economic potential of that. And that's where the story of BMI becomes relevant. Because as BMI demonstrated, competition here can achieve some form of balance. The same thing can happen now. We don't have a public domain to draw upon now, so instead what we need is two types of changes. First, that artists and creators embrace the idea, choose, that their work be made available more freely. So for example, they can say their work is available freely for non-commercial, this amateur type of use, but not freely for any commercial use. And second, we need the businesses that are building out this read-write culture to embrace this opportunity expressly, to enable it, so that this ecology of free content or freer content can grow on a neutral platform where they both exist simultaneously, so that more free can compete with less free, and the opportunity to develop the creativity in that competition can teach one the lessons of the other. Now, I would talk about one particular such plan that I know something about, but I don't want to violate Ted's first commandment of selling, so I'm not going to talk about this at all. I'm instead just going to remind you of the point that BMI teaches us, that artist choice is the key for new technology having an opportunity to be open for business. And we need to build artist choice here if these new technologies are to have that opportunity. But let me end with something I think much more important in business. It's the point about how this connects to our kids. We have to recognize they are different from us. This is us, right? We made mixed tapes, they remix music. We watched TV, they make TV. It is technology that has made them different. And as we see what this technology can do, we need to recognize you can't kill the instinct the technology produces. We can only criminalize it. We can't stop our kids from using it. We can only drive it underground. We can't make our kids passive again. We can only make them, quote, pirates. And is that good? We live in this weird time, this kind of age of prohibitions, where in many areas of our life, we live life constantly against the law. Ordinary people live life against the law, and that's what we are doing to our kids. They live life knowing they live it against the law. That realization is extraordinarily corrosive, extraordinarily corrupting. And in a democracy, we ought to be able to do better at least for them, if not for opening for business. Thank you very much.
That was Larry Lessig in 2007, which seems like a very long time ago at this point. But don't let that throw you. The concepts he's putting down there, the word picture of farmers in Nebraska thinking they could maybe charge airlines a fee to fly over their land. Fast forwarding to today, where we have, well, let's go with it, Spotify, Hulu, and so on, right? Understand that if you're using Spotify, many of us are, right? You are paying, what, $4.99 a month. And those dollars across the economy of scale of millions of Spotify users are made available and shared with the creatives, the songwriters, the singers, the producers of the music. And that's how they're being compensated. All they really need is a penny from a few million people to make a living, if that makes sense, on a song. Pretty awesome concept. Margaret Gould Stewart, YouTube's head of user experience, she's going to talk to us about, and this is still relatively outdated, 10 years ago. It was hard for me to find videos that explained how YouTube's, checks new content, but obviously you can't just rip a song or a music video and put it on YouTube and take credit for it, right? We have to assign credit to the original songwriter. Under fair use, we could use a part or a piece for a new creative work, which again, we're talking about what fair use and copyright mean here. So YouTube has logarithms and has scanning and surveillance systems to kind of check that. This is super fascinating. This will make, I think, really a lot of sense to you.
So if you're in the audience today, or maybe you're watching this talk in some other time or place, you are a participant in the digital rights ecosystem. And whether you're an artist, a technologist, a lawyer, or a fan, the handling of copyright directly impacts your life. Now, rights management is no longer simply a question of ownership. It's a complex web of relationships and a critical part of our cultural landscape. Now, YouTube cares deeply about the rights of content owners, but in order to give them choices about what they can do with copies, mashups, and more, we need to first identify when copyrighted material is uploaded to our site. Let's look at a specific video so you can see how it works. 2 years ago, recording artist Chris Brown released the official video of his single, Forever. A fan saw it on TV, recorded it with her camera phone, and uploaded it to YouTube. Now, because Sony Music had registered Chris Brown's video in our Content ID system, within seconds of attempting to upload the video, the copy was detected, giving Sony the choice of what to do next. But how do we know that the user's video is a copy? Well, it starts with content owners delivering assets into our database, along with a usage policy that tells us what to do when we find a match. We compare each upload against all of the reference files in our database. Now, this heat map is going to show you how the brain of the system works. Here we can see the original reference file being compared to the user-generated content. The system compares every moment of one to the other to see if there's a match. Now, this means that we can identify a match even if the copy uses just a portion of the original file, plays it in slow motion, and has degraded audio and video quality. And we do this every time that a video is uploaded to YouTube, and that's over 20 hours of video every minute. When we find a match, we apply the policy that the rights owner has set down. And the scale and the speed of this system is truly breathtaking. We're not just talking about a few videos. We're talking about over 100 years of video every day between new uploads and the legacy scans we regularly do across all of the content on the site. And when we compare those 100 years of video, we're comparing it against millions of reference files in our database. It'd be like 36,000 people staring at 36,000 monitors each and every day without so much as a coffee break. Now, what do we do when we find a match? Well, most rights owners, instead of blocking, will allow the copy to be published, and then they benefit through the exposure, advertising, and linked sales. Remember Chris Brown's video Forever? Well, it had its day in the sun, and then it dropped off the charts, and that looked like the end of the story. But sometime last year, a young couple got married. This is their wedding video. You may have seen it. What's amazing about this is if the processional of the wedding was this much fun, can you imagine how much fun the reception must have been? I mean, who are these people? I totally want to go to that wedding. So their little wedding video went on to get over 40 million views. And instead of Sony blocking, they allowed the upload to occur, and they put advertising against it and linked from it to iTunes. And the song, 18 months old, went back to number 4 on the iTunes charts. So Sony is generating revenue from both of these. And Jill and Kevin, the happy couple, well, they came back from their honeymoon and found that their video had gone crazy viral. And they ended up on a bunch of talk shows, and they used it as an opportunity to make a difference. The videos inspired over $26,000 in donations to end domestic violence. And the JK wedding dance became so popular that NBC parodied it on the season finale of The Office, which just goes to show it's truly an ecosystem of culture, because it's not just amateurs borrowing from big studios, but sometimes big studios borrowing back. By empowering choice, we can create a culture of opportunity. And all it took to change things around was to allow for choice through rights identification. So why has no one ever solved this problem before? It's because it's a big problem and it's complicated and messy. It's not uncommon for a single video to have multiple rights owners. There's musical labels, there's multiple music publishers, and each of these can vary by country. And there's lots of cases where we have more than one work mashed together, so we have to manage many claims to the same video. YouTube's Content ID system addresses all of these cases, but the system only works with the participation of rights owners. If you have content that others are uploading to YouTube, you should register in the Content ID system, and then you'll have the choice about how your content is used. And think carefully about the policies that you attach to that content. By simply blocking all reuse, you'll miss out on new art forms, new audiences, new distribution channels, and new revenue streams. But it's not just about dollars and impressions. Just look at all the joy that was spread through progressive rights management and new technology. And I think we can all agree that joy is definitely an idea worth spreading. Thank you.
Okay, that's very pro YouTube, no doubt. But it does give us a sense of the policies involved. In this case, I think it was at Sony Records and Chris Brown's original song. And then it's really actually a really good example of convergence from the previous unit or video that you watched. Because you have a record label, you have a music artist, then you have sort of, if you will, home video of a wedding. And then you have NBC's The Office kind of co-opting that and using it. And even in there was some philanthropy in terms of the family giving the advertising bucks from YouTube, some $26,000 to help fight domestic violence. So it's kind of a wonderful chorus there of unity. And along the way, I would use it as a way of describing, again, convergence from the previous unit. So that's some YouTube testing capability, if you will, and screening of copyrighted material during an upload or after an upload before it's permitted to go live or be published on YouTube. Okay, this is a film. It's the trailer to a feature-length film documentary about other people's footage. It's completely 100% about copyright and primarily fair use. And you're going to hear from a copyright fair use attorney that lives in Los Angeles and some other creatives And the trailer is enough for you to get the point. So let's watch this, and I will again talk on the other side.
When I was making the film Who Needs Sleep, there was a commercial, and it was a Coors commercial. And of course, what we're trying to say in the film is that if you don't get any sleep, it's unsafe and unhealthy. And there was a really exciting, well-sung commercial, Coors commercial that said, you know, you gotta keep alive when you drink this stuff. It doesn't matter, you know, party all night, you know.
Well, you're never gonna get it. Tell me what's that for? You happy with what you get? This guy's been awake since the Second World War. Well, you're never gonna get it.
And so I wanted to use that music mostly. It was all the music, few shots from it. And someone said, well, you just can't do that. I said, well, you know, I've seen it on TV. Jim, we're working 16 hours. Give me some advice. What can we do?
If you're shooting at night, your crew's going to be sleepy, even if you try to make up for those hours during the day. A lot of people get used to being tired. Folks develop a lifestyle saying, I don't need sleep.
Who needs sleep? Who needs sleep?
In fact, this was the big thing with the Coors commercial. It reflects society's way of looking at sleep as having no function.
So actually by changing the context of it, just not what the commercial was saying, but making a comment about sleep per se, Michael Donaldson assured me that I wouldn't be sued. And that was about 5 years ago, and I haven't had any suits at all.
Haskell's use of that footage was rock solid. He had made the point that there were a lot of influences to convince people that they really didn't need sleep. What he used was reasonably appropriate length, and the connection was crystal clear. So that was rock solid. We didn't even get a phone call on that. 20 Feet from Stardom. Most of that music was licensed, but there was a clip of Michael Jackson.
Michael really did inspire me and saying like, wow, it's okay to dream this big. It's okay to realize your dreams.
I still believe someday you'll come.
The reason that clip from 20 Feet from Stardom was so rock solid is that Judith had talked about that particular performance and how it changed her career. Absolutely. So, of course, you had to show that, and it was being used just after Jackson died, and it was hard to get a hold of anybody from the estate for permission, which probably wouldn't have come anyway. And if it had, it would have been very, very expensive. This was a small documentary. So the need to access fair use was clear, and the appropriateness, the way it fit into the fair use doctrine was so rock solid.
Bowling for Columbine, which I was an archival producer for in Fahrenheit 9/11, and NT was supervising producer. We relied on third-party footage to tell those stories. 40% of Bowling for Columbine were third-party images, and more than 50% of Fahrenheit 9/11 was third-party images. Both of those films dealt with the way that the media caved to really powerful interests. So, for example, in Bowling for Columbine, you know, there's a sequence that's called Black, Black, Black. And in that sequence, there's a montage of images from local news stations all over the country where they identify suspects, criminal suspects, and how do they identify them? Black male, black male, black male, with a sketch. You know, it's ridiculous.
Now, the suspect is a black male in his 20s. We are told he has a large afro, sideburns. He was wearing a silver chain at the time.
Police say the suspect is a black man, 6'1", 160 to 180 pounds, about 35 years in age.
Suspect is a black male, aged 16 to 18.
The suspect is African American. Police
say
the black man.
Suspect.
Suspect.
The suspect is a a black male.
Black man.
Black man.
Black male.
Male.
Man. Black man.
There's no way that those stations are going to license that material to you, so you have to rely on fair use, in a case like that.
So yeah, other people's footage. Again, it's a feature-length film, and it's helping filmmakers make their case, or showing that it's okay, in fact, it's important to be able to excerpt portion of a previous work or a song or something like that and use it in your new creative work. We'll talk more about exactly those details and how they work. The first guy there, Haxel Wexler, is an Academy Award-winning cinematographer. He was making a film about the stress of long hours and lack of sleep for crew members and so on. Obviously, the film 20 Feet from Stardom, the young lady and then the producers of a very low budget documentary film would never be able to afford to pay the license, tens of thousands of dollars, to use a Michael Jackson song. That would be to the estate of Michael Jackson in their film. But under fair use, they are able and allowed to use it. So that's the concept there. Okay, remember this guy, Jack Ponti, and how artists can finally get paid in the digital age. I'm just going to show a very brief clip from this because you saw it earlier in the semester, I think during the radio section. But it's a good example of monetization, the way an artist can make some money by having subscribers. I talked about Spotify, and that's certainly a very good way, and probably the best way for a top name or even medium top name music artist to make money, is to have their work on Spotify and then get a little stake of all of us paying $4.99 a month times millions, right? Patreon is that subscription service. So just a quick clip from this, and then we'll talk on the other side.
This is an actual snapshot of my YouTube dashboard from a 28-day period that shows 1 million views and $166 of ad earnings for those views. The whole machine in 2013 that took art online and outputted money was totally non-functional. It doesn't matter if you're a newspaper or an institution or an independent creator. A webcomic with 20,000 monthly readers, 20,000 monthly readers gets paid a couple $100 in ad revenue. This is 20,000 people. Like, in what world is this not enough? I don't understand. What systems have we built where this is insufficient for a person to make a living? So I actually have a theory about this. I think it's been a weird 100 years. Yeah. So about 100 years ago, humans figured out how to record sound onto a wax cylinder. That was the beginning of the phonograph. Right around the same time, we figured out how to record light onto a piece of photographic paper, celluloid, the beginning of film and television. And so for the first time, you could store art on a thing, which was amazing. Art used to be completely ephemeral, so if you missed the symphony, you just didn't get to hear the orchestra. But now, for the first time, you could store the orchestra's performance on a physical object and listen to it later, which was amazing. It was so amazing, in fact, that for the next 100 years, between 1900 and 2000, humans built just billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure to essentially help artists do two things. First, put their art on a thing. And second, get that thing around the world to the people who wanted the art. So much industry is devoted to these two problems. Oh my gosh, there's trucking companies and brick and mortar and marketing firms and CD jewel case manufacturers, and all devoted to these two problems. And then we all know what happened 10 years ago. The internet matures and we get Spotify and Facebook and YouTube and iTunes and Google search, and 100 years of infrastructure and supply chains and distribution systems and monetization schemes are completely bypassed in a decade. After 100 years of designing these things, it's no wonder that it's just totally broken for creative people right now. It's no wonder that the monetization part of the chain doesn't work given this new context. But what gets me super excited to be a creator right now, to be alive today, to be a creative person right now, is realizing that we're only 10 years into figuring out this new machine. to figuring out the next 100 years of infrastructure for our creators. And you can tell we're only 10 years in. There's a lot of trial and error. There's some really good ideas forming. There's a lot of experimentation. We're figuring out what works and what doesn't. Like Twitch streamers. Who's heard of Twitch? Twitch streamers are making $3,000 to $5,000 a month uploading, streaming gaming content. The big ones are making over $100,000 a year. There's a site called YouNow. It's an app. It allows musicians and vloggers to get paid in digital goods from fans. So I'm also working on the problem. 4 years ago, started a company called Patreon with a friend of mine. We're 80 people now working on this problem. It's basically a membership platform that makes it really easy for creators to get paid every month from their fans to earn a living. For a creator, it's like having a salary for being a creative person. And this is one of our creators. They're called Kinda Funny. They have about 220,000 subscribers on YouTube. And when they upload a video, it gets somewhere around 15,000 views to 100,000 views. I want you to check yourselves right now. I think when we hear numbers like that, when we hear 15,000 views and we see content like this, we just like snap categorize it as being not as legitimate as like a morning show that you'd hear on the radio, or a talk show that you'd see on NBC or something. But when Kinda Funny launched on Patreon, within a few weeks, they were making $31,000 per month for this show.
Here's another clip. Everything is a Remix, Fair Use by Kirby Ferguson. And this is not long, but pay close attention. There's a couple of key ingredients that are explained in this video that really exemplify or sort of prove out exactly what fair use doctrine is. Let's watch.
Media is everywhere. Mostly we experience it through screens of various sizes. The stories we get through media connect us to a world beyond our direct experience. And these stories shape our understanding of ourselves, of others, and of the world. Just like your body is strongly influenced by the food you consume, your mind is strongly influenced by the media you consume. Media is important, so we need to better understand it, we need to analyze it, and we need to challenge it. And this can require copying media in order to demonstrate your point. But wait, doesn't copyright law prohibit making copies of other people's media? How do you copy media legally? In the United States, this kind of speech is protected by fair use. Fair use is the right to use copyrighted materials without permission for certain socially valuable uses. You may have never heard of fair use, but you've definitely seen it in action.
I just ate a hot dog.
Yeah. Hello, darkness, my old friend.
That's an interesting twist.
It's used in the news, in satire, in documentaries, and of course, it's all over the place here on YouTube. There's vlogs, remixes, video essays, response videos, and parodies, which is when you copy something in order to criticize it. Parodies are often, but not always, humorous. There are many kinds of fair use, but for creators, this often means you are transforming media into something new. You are repurposing or changing it by adding new expression or new meaning. Fair use is rooted in the First Amendment. Without fair use, copyright would restrict freedom of speech. Memes can be an example of transformative use.
One does not simply walk into Mordor and the great eye.
Memes often remix clips, add animation, or add titles in order to transform them into something new. Many memes can be considered fair use because they transcend their sources, becoming a kind of language of their own and enriching cultural expression.
That's okay.
Whether your use is transformative or not can be tricky to determine without a lawyer. But there's two popular categories that are easier to use. These are criticism and commentary. In other words, making an argument or expressing an opinion. So if your video is criticism or commentary, it should qualify for fair use. But wait, this doesn't allow you to just do whatever you want and make up some excuse for why it's fair use. You have to practice fair use in a particular way. I recommend using this 3-step test for each clip you want to use. Number 1, is the clip you are using illustrating a point? Pretty simple, you need to have a good reason for using the clip, like it provides an example that supports your argument or it demonstrates what you mean. You can't use it just because you like it or it's entertaining. Number 2, is this point clear to the average viewer? Anybody should be able to understand why you're using the clip without you having to explain it to them. And lastly, number 3, did you use only the amount that was reasonably appropriate to make your point? You can't use more of the clip than is relevant, so it can't keep playing before or after you've made your point. Keep it as short as possible. Those are the 3 questions you need to ask yourself for every clip you want to use. So if your video is criticism or commentary, including parody, ask yourself these 3 questions for each of your clips. If you can answer yes to all 3, you have a strong case for fair use. This isn't the only way to do fair use, but it is a simple and effective way. And that is how you can legally use copyrighted material you don't own. That is how you can copy media legally.
Is the clip you are using illustrating a point? Is the point clear to the average viewer? Did you use only the amount that was reasonably appropriate to make your point? Those are the 3 key points when it comes to fair use. I talked about at the beginning of this narrated PowerPoint best practices, and then this is a link to the code of best practices and fair use for online video. This is from the School of Communication, American University, Washington, DC. And there's a, you can download it as a PDF, and it's really laying out the details for documentary filmmakers in terms of their rights under the fair use doctrine in copyright law. Super important. And that concludes my lecture on copyright and fair use. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and I'll see you next time.